Hi, fifth graders. It's Friday for me again, but I'll say Happy Poetry Day. I heard from Carol that a lot of you have already sent her poems. I haven't seen any of them yet, but I think she's going to send them on to me at some point soon. So if you're writing, I'm really glad you're writing. If you haven't started writing yet, I hope you do. We talked a lot earlier in the year about how poetry begins with noticing. And I think there's a lot to notice right now. Things are different, and it's good to pay attention and even write down what you're seeing or thinking or feeling that's unusual. And it gives you something to look back at later. You think you're going to remember all this stuff, but it just drifts away pretty fast. So writing a poem or two, making little notes about what you see can be very worthwhile. Um, I think the last class we had at Cragmont, we wrote poems about animals. And today we're going to write poems about people. So how do you reveal a person? I really like that word reveal. And I think it's an important word for poets. When I think of reveal, I think of a curtain opening and showing something behind the curtain that you didn't expect to see. And maybe we talked about this a little bit, that experience of going to a play where when it begins, the curtain is closed, and at a certain point, the curtain goes up or it goes apart, and you see this other world that really makes you think and makes you feel because it's totally unexpected. So that's what you try to do in poems a lot of the time, is you're presenting a world, and at some point you want to pull that curtain and reveal something that your reader or your audience didn't expect and is surprised by and maybe even amazed. So how do you reveal a person? You know, if you know someone really well and you wanted to tell someone else what that person is like, what would you say to give an idea of another actual person? Now, this is where I would hope you'd be speaking up in class and, saying, Dave, I'd describe how the person looks. And looks are certainly something we think about when we think about a person. But you can have the most detailed photograph of someone, and no matter how many times you look at the photograph or how many photographs you look at, just from an appearance, you don't feel like you know that person well. There's what the person does, and a famous cliche is that actions speak louder than words. So if I promise I'm going to be here next Friday teaching poetry, that's one thing. But if I actually am here next Friday teaching poetry, that's something else. And you look at people based on what they do, and we tend to give value in terms of knowing someone to kind of knowing how they act in different situations. And the poems we're going to look at today, a lot of them have actions that say something about who a person is. Now, how a person makes you feel, that's something you can put in a poem that conveys something about that person to you. So when you're trying to reveal character, reveal what a person is really like, you've got actions, you've got dialogue, the things that the person says. Sometimes you can give their thoughts. I mean, this is a poem. You can say what someone else is thinking. You can ascribe thoughts to them. And sometimes there's a difference between what we think and how we act. And that's interesting. And sometimes there's a difference between what we say and how we act and what we think. And all that stuff is interesting and can go into a poem. Um, there's also description, physical description. There's where you see a person, where you find that person. Are they walking in the country? Are they sitting under a tree? Are they hunched over at their computer playing a game? Where you put a person when you describe them can say something about who the person is. Sometimes metaphors are useful to describe someone, especially when you're trying to convey how a person makes you feel. This question of when you know a person well, what does that mean? I'm not sure. But to me, it means I have a fairly good idea of what they do or how they act or what they think in a particular situation. And when I know that about someone, or I feel like I can guess what they do, then I think I know them well. But sometimes that's hard to convey to somebody else. So anyway, our first poem, and I hope that you've received these poems and you can either print them out or just see them on your computer. I'm reading through them once, but it really helps with a poem to look at it, more than once and go through it and see how the parts fit together, how the words relate to each other, either in terms of rhythm or rhyme or pace, the formality of the language. So this poem is called Man with a Metal Detector. He looks like the kind of guy people make fun of. The bulky earphones, that weird contraption, some kind of vacuum to sniff the scent of gold. Mom tells me last year he lost his wife to cancer. They were best friends, married 40 years. He walks the lonely beach in an ugly Hawaiian shirt, eyes shut, concentrating, listening for the sound of somebody else's lost treasure. So I'm going to hold up the poem. You can kind of see it's got 3 sections. Each is like a paragraph. They're called stanzas in a poem. And what's interesting to me, this is where I'm asking you, what do you notice about the poem? And one thing I'd really hope that you would notice is that in the first stanza and the third stanza, you see the person from the outside. You see how they look. But in the middle stanza, you learn something about who they are inside. So, Man with a Metal Detector. I hope everyone has seen those metal detectors. It's well described in the poem. He looks like the kind of guy people make fun of, the bulky earphones, that weird contraption, some kind of vacuum to sniff the scent of gold. So at the beginning, you're looking at this guy. You find out later he's in an ugly Hawaiian shirt. He's walking along the beach, and you think, oh, who's that? And then you find out, Mom tells me, last year he lost his wife to cancer. They were best friends, married for 40 years. And that gives you an idea of what is maybe on this person's mind. And he's going along the beach. His eyes are shut. And the poem ends with this couple of lines, listening for the sound of somebody else's lost treasure. And why do you think he's looking for somebody else's lost treasure? Why isn't he looking for his own treasure? What is it about this guy? I could offer you an answer, but I think it's better if you come up with an answer on your own. Now, it looks like my computer may be having trouble. My picture went away. I hope the video continued. That's an example of a poem that shows someone through an action. And here's another poem. This is one of my favorites. It's called Grandmother's Spit. And before I read it, I'll show it to you. It looks a little different. Notice it's got really long lines. It's all one stanza. It's a little more dense. We've talked about details that appeal to the senses, things you can see and smell and taste. And this grandmother's spit, like kids listening to this poem often like kind of cringe because they can almost feel what's going on in the poem. And that's because it uses details that appeal to the senses. And maybe appeal is a funny word. Maybe they, gross out the senses, but they engage your senses. Grandmother's spit. To wipe the sleep grains from my eyes or rub a food smudge from my cheek, grandmother'd lick her rough right thumb and order me, come here. She'd clutch my arm and hold me near her face while with that spit damp thumb she scrubbed the spot. I struggled like a kitten being licked, then leaned into the touch, again cat-like, helping that fierce thumb scour loose the dirt. It smelled, her spit, of lipstick and tobacco, breath warm, enveloping. She'd hold me at arm's length, peer hard into my face, and state, "You're clean." When she let go, I'd crouch behind the door and, with my own spit, rub the clean spot raw. So the question I always ask when I read this poem is, do you think the poet, as a kid, does he like this thing that his grandma does, or does he hate it, or both? And the other question I like to ask is, do you think he's going to do that to his own kid? And I mean, I don't know the answer to those questions. People come up with their own answers with a poem. That's one of the nice things about poems, is you can have your own interpretation, and you're as entitled to your interpretation as anyone else is to theirs. But there are things in the poem that you can interpret. And what I like in this poem is how he struggles, but then he leans into the touch. And that leaning into the touch makes me think, yeah, he's grossed out. There's something he hates, but there's also something he likes. So he leans in. And the fact that the way he deals with it is to use his own spit to clean the spot, that makes me think maybe he's going to do this to a kid of his own. So this is poems about people. And to me, this poem is both about the grandmother and the poet kid and their relationship. And it's nice in a poem when you're revealing more than one thing. But it says a lot to me about how the kid feels about his grandmother and who she is, and maybe who he'll become. Now, here's one more poem. It's It's really only about one thing. The name of the poem is Quiet Until the Thaw. And the poet was a Native American in the Cree tribe. And Quiet Until the Thaw is the name of another person in the tribe. So it's good to know that going in. Quiet until the thaw. Her name tells of how it was with her. The truth is, she did not speak in winter. Everyone learned not to ask her questions in winter, once this was known about her. The first winter this happened, we looked in her mouth to see if something was frozen. Her tongue, maybe, or something else in there. But after the thaw, she spoke again and told us it was fine for her that way. So each spring, we look forward to that. Now, I forgot to talk about thaw and what thaw means. So if that's a new word to you, thaw is when something is really cold and then you warm it up. So we had an old refrigerator when I was a kid, and the freezer, the ice would build up, and you have to thaw the freezer, and you'd take hot water and pour it in there, and the ice would melt, and it was kind of a messy job, but that was thawing. And in weather, the thaw is what comes at the end of the winter, in places where it's really cold and it snows and the snow freezes and there's ice. And so in spring, when it starts to warm up, that ice starts to melt, and that's the thaw. And this person, quiet until the thaw, doesn't speak in winter when everything is frozen. But when things start to warm up, she talks again. And he says, so each spring we look forward to that. The other thing that I really like in this poem is this image of all these people looking into the person's mouth, trying to figure out what's wrong. And, in a poem, if you can give an image like that, something that will stick in the reader's mind that they'll remember, that's a good way to reveal something. So there's more poems I could read. I'm going to include them in the poems that Carol sends you. But let's stop with those three and think about someone you could try to reveal. Maybe it's someone you know really well. I think that's a great thing to do. Or maybe it's someone like the man with the metal detector, someone you see from a distance and you have to imagine, who they are and what they're like. And feel free to write more than one poem, maybe taking different approaches to who you write about and what you reveal about them. So I'm wishing you a good week. I hope you have good writing. A friend of mine likes to say, anything worth doing is worth doing poorly. You don't have to feel like you got to write a great poem. Just write a poem. It's worthwhile, no matter what you come up with. So I'll sort of see you in another week.